The blood on his hands had barely dried when Vaughn swore the oath that would chain him to a promise more binding than iron, standing over his mother's fresh grave in the scorching Arizona heat of 1878, vowing he would never let another innocent suffer at the hands of ruthless men again, even if it cost him everything he held dear. The dirt beneath his boots was still loose. The wooden cross he had carved himself casting a long shadow across the mound as the sun began its descent behind the jagged mountains surrounding Gila City. His mother had been caught in the crossfire of a range war between cattle barons, an innocent woman whose only crime was living on land that powerful men wanted, and Caleb had arrived just minutes too late to save her. The years that followed turned him into something harder than the desert rock, a rancher who defended the defenseless with the same ferocity he used to protect his cattle. His ranch, modest but thriving, sat on the eastern edge of Gila City, where the Gila River provided enough water to sustain his herd and the few families who worked alongside him. Caleb never forgot that oath, never let a single day pass without remembering why he had spoken those words. He turned away anyone who tried to hire him for personal vendettas, anyone who wanted him to use his gun for greed or power. The oath was specific, carved into his soul like scripture. He would only fight for those who could not fight for themselves, and nothing, not money nor threat nor temptation, would sway him from that path. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September 1883 when everything changed. Caleb was mending fence posts on the western border of his property, his shirt soaked through with sweat despite the season's cooling temperatures, when he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. He straightened, squinting against the sun, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle leaning against the fence post. What he saw made him freeze for just a moment. A woman riding hard on a bay mare, her dark hair streaming behind her, her dress torn at the hem and covered in dust. She was looking over her shoulder, and even from a distance, Caleb could see the fear etched across her face behind her. 3 riders were gaining ground, their horses fresher, their intent clear from the way they spread out to cut off any escape route. Caleb did not hesitate. He grabbed his rifle, vaulted over the fence, and ran toward his own horse tethered nearby. By the time he was in the saddle, the woman had changed direction, heading straight toward him, whether by accident or desperation he could not tell. Her eyes locked with his as she approached, and he saw something in them that reminded him of his mother in those final moments. A plea for help from someone who had nowhere else to turn. "Help me, please," she called out, her voice hoarse but strong despite her obvious exhaustion. Caleb positioned himself between her and the pursuing riders, his rifle raised. "That is far enough," he shouted as the 3 men slowed their horses, sizing him up. They were the type he had seen too many times. Hired guns with cold eyes and no conscience, men who would do anything for the right price. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his left cheek, sneered. "This is not your concern, rancher. The lady owes money to our employer. We are just collecting what is due." "I do not owe anyone anything," the woman protested from behind Caleb. "They work for Marcus Thornton. He wants my land, and when I would not sell, he had my father killed. Now he is trying to force me into marriage or take the land through false debt claims." Caleb's jaw tightened. This was exactly the kind of situation his oath compelled him to address. "Ride off now, and there will be no trouble. Stay, and you will regret it." The scarred man laughed. 3 against 1, I like those odds." What happened next unfolded in seconds. The scarred man went for his gun, but Caleb's rifle spoke first, sending a bullet that grazed the man's shoulder and caused him to drop his weapon with a curse. The other 2 hesitated, and in that moment of indecision, Caleb chambered another round. "Next shot will not miss. Your choice." The three men exchanged glances, and the scarred man clutched his bleeding shoulder. "Thornton will hear about this," he spat before turning his horse. The other two followed, and soon they were nothing but dust clouds in the distance. Caleb lowered his rifle and turned to the woman, who had dismounted and was standing with one hand pressed against her chest, trying to catch her breath. Up close, she was even more striking than he had first realized, with dark eyes that held both strength and vulnerability, high cheekbones, and a determined set to her jaw. She could not have been more than 25 years old, and despite the fear she had just experienced, she stood tall. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier now. "I am Charlotte Nolan. My father owned the Triple N Ranch about 15 miles north of here. He died 3 weeks ago, and ever since then, Marcus Thornton has been making my life hell." "Caleb Vaughn," he replied, extending his hand. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused from work. "You are safe now, but those men will be back, probably with more. You cannot go home alone." Charlotte's expression hardened. "I will not be driven from my land. My father built that ranch from nothing, and I will not let Thornton steal it just because he thinks a woman cannot stand against him." Caleb recognized that determination because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. "I am not suggesting you give up. I am suggesting you let me help you. Those men will not stop, and Thornton has the money to hire as many guns as he wants. You need someone on your side. Why would you help me? You do not even know me." He looked toward his mother's grave, visible in the distance on a small hill near his ranch house. "I made an oath to help people who cannot fight alone against those who abuse power. Your situation fits that oath perfectly." Charlotte followed his gaze, and something in her expression softened. "An oath is a serious thing." "The most serious thing in my life," Caleb confirmed. "Come back to my ranch. You can rest, and we can figure out a plan to deal with Thornton. Your horse looks about done in, and you need food and water." She hesitated, clearly torn between accepting help and maintaining her independence, but exhaustion and practicality won out. "All right. But I need to go back to my ranch eventually. I have livestock that need tending, and I will not abandon them." "We will figure it out," Caleb assured her, mounting his horse. Together they rode toward his ranch, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the desert landscape. As they rode, Charlotte told him the whole story. Her father, Thomas Nolan, had been one of the first ranchers in the area, claiming his land legally and working it honestly for nearly 30 years. He had raised Charlotte alone after her mother died giving birth to her, teaching her everything about running a ranch. When he passed away from a sudden fever, Charlotte had expected to continue his legacy. Instead, Marcus Thornton, who owned the largest spread in the county, had shown up at her door 3 days after the funeral with an offer to buy her out for a fraction of what the land was worth. When she refused, things escalated quickly. Thornton claimed her father had owed him money, producing documents that Charlotte insisted were forgeries. Then he had proposed marriage, suggesting it would be the easiest solution for everyone. When Charlotte rejected him with the disdain such a proposal deserved, Thornton's men started harassing her workers, most of whom fled rather than risk their lives. Fences were cut, cattle stolen, and finally, today, his men had come to drag her back to Thornton's ranch by force. "He thinks he can do whatever he wants because he has money and connections," Charlotte said bitterly as they reached Caleb's ranch. "The sheriff is in his pocket, the judge is his cousin, and most people in town are too scared to stand against him." Caleb helped her dismount in front of his house, a solid adobe structure with a wide porch and thick walls designed to keep out the desert heat. "Then we will have to be smarter than him. Money and connections mean nothing if we can prove he is breaking the law in a way that cannot be ignored." A woman in her 50s came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Maria Reyes had worked for Caleb since he bought the ranch, serving as housekeeper and cook, though he considered her more family than employee. She took one look at Charlotte and immediately went into action. "Ay, Dios mío, look at you, poor thing. Come inside right now. You need food and rest." Charlotte smiled gratefully, and Caleb watched as Maria ushered her into the house with the kind of maternal concern that reminded him painfully of his own mother. He took care of the horses, making sure Charlotte's mare got extra oats and a thorough rub-down, then joined them inside. Over dinner, they discussed strategy. Caleb's ranch foreman, Diego Reyes, Maria's son, joined them and listened carefully as Charlotte outlined everything she knew about Thornton's operation. Diego was a shrewd man in his early 30s who had helped Caleb build his ranch into a successful enterprise. His input would be invaluable. "We need proof of his crimes," Diego said thoughtfully. "Witnesses who will testify, documents that show the forgeries, something concrete that even his cousin, the judge, cannot ignore. And we need to protect Charlotte and her ranch while we gather that proof," Caleb added. "Diego, I want you to take some of our men and ride to the Triple N tomorrow. Secure the property, tend the livestock, and make sure Thornton's men know we are watching." "What about you?" Diego asked. "I am going into town tomorrow with Charlotte. We are going to visit the land office and get copies of all the legal documents related to her father's property. Then we are going to the telegraph office. If the local law will not help, maybe the territorial authorities will." Charlotte looked at him with something approaching wonder. "You have thought this through quickly." "I have dealt with men like Thornton before," Caleb said simply. "They all operate the same way: intimidation, corruption, and violence. The key is finding their weakness and exploiting it before they can react." That night, Maria set Charlotte up in the guest room, providing her with clean clothes and a warm bath. Caleb sat on his porch, smoking his pipe and staring at the stars scattered across the vast Arizona sky. He thought about his oath, about how Charlotte Nolan had literally ridden into his life at the exact moment she needed help most. Some might call it coincidence, but Caleb had stopped believing in coincidence years ago. This was meant to happen, and he would see it through to the end, whatever that end might be. What he did not expect was the way his heart had started beating faster when Charlotte smiled at him across the dinner table, or the way her presence seemed to fill his house with a warmth it had lacked for years. He pushed those thoughts aside. She needed his protection, not his feelings. The oath came first. It always came first. Inside, Charlotte lay in the comfortable bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the tall rancher who had saved her without hesitation. She had been alone for so long, bearing the weight of her father's death and Thornton's harassment without anyone to lean on. Caleb Vaughn's immediate acceptance of her situation, his unwavering commitment to help, felt almost too good to be true. Yet there was something in his eyes, a depth of pain and purpose, that told her his oath was real. He had suffered, lost someone, and transformed that loss into something meaningful. She found herself wondering about him, about what had driven him to make such an oath, about the woman who had clearly taught him such strong values before she died. Charlotte had always been independent, never imagining she would need a man's help for anything. Her father had raised her to be self-sufficient, to handle any challenge a ranch could throw at her. But this was different. Thornton was not a challenge she could rope or brand or fix with hard work. He was a predator, and she needed an ally who understood how predators thought. As she drifted off to sleep, her last thought was that she was glad that ally was Caleb Vaughn. The next morning dawned clear and hot. Caleb was up before sunrise, as always, but he found Charlotte already awake and dressed in the spare clothes Maria had provided. They fit reasonably well, though they were clearly Maria's and a bit loose on Charlotte's slimmer frame. "I am used to early mornings," Charlotte explained when Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Cattle do not care if you are tired." He smiled, a rare expression that transformed his usually serious face. "Then you will fit right in around here." After a quick breakfast, they saddled fresh horses and rode toward Gila City. The town was small but growing, fueled by the nearby mines and the ranches that dotted the surrounding territory. The main street featured a general store, a saloon, the sheriff's office, a bank, a hotel, and various other businesses that served the community's needs. The land office sat near the bank, a small building with peeling paint and dusty windows. Inside, they found the clerk, an elderly man named Arthur Hobbs who had been recording property transactions since before Arizona was even a territory. He looked up from his ledger, his expression neutral until he recognized Charlotte. "Miss Nolan," he said carefully, "I heard about your troubles. I am sorry about your father." "Thank you, Mr. Hobbs," Charlotte replied. "I need copies of all the documents related to my father's property, the original land grant, any transactions, mortgages, everything." Hobbs glanced toward the door nervously. "Miss Nolan, Mr. Thornton was very clear that no one was to provide you with those documents. He said there were legal issues that needed to be resolved first." Caleb stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Hobbs, Marcus Thornton has no legal authority to prevent a property owner from accessing public records. If you refuse, we will simply go to the territorial capital and get them there, along with filing a complaint about obstruction. I imagine that would not look good for you." The clerk paled slightly. "I do not want any trouble." "Then do your job," Caleb said, not unkindly. "Miss Nolan has every right to those documents." Hobbs hesitated a moment longer, then sighed and turned to his files. It took him nearly an hour, but he eventually produced copies of everything related to the Triple N Ranch. Charlotte paid the small fee, and they left with a thick envelope of papers. Their next stop was the telegraph office, where Caleb sent a detailed message to the territorial governor's office in Prescott, outlining Thornton's actions and requesting an investigation. The telegraph operator, a young man who clearly admired Thornton's wealth and influence, looked skeptical but sent the message as requested. "That will just make him angry," the operator said. "Good," Caleb replied. "Angry men make mistakes." As they walked back toward their horses, Charlotte clutched the envelope of documents like a lifeline. "Do you really think the territorial authorities will help?" "I think they will at least ask questions, and questions make it harder for Thornton to operate freely. Men like him thrive in the shadows, shine light on them, and they start to squirm." They were about to mount their horses when a voice called out from across the street. "Vaughn!" Caleb turned to see Sheriff Daniel Carson approaching, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a badge that seemed too small for his large belly. Carson's allegiance to Thornton was well known, but he still had to maintain at least the appearance of law enforcement. "Sheriff," Caleb greeted him evenly. Carson's eyes moved to Charlotte and his expression soured. "Miss Nolan, you need to come with me. There is a warrant for your arrest." "On what charges?" Charlotte demanded, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Theft of cattle belonging to Marcus Thornton. He says you have been stealing his stock to replace the ones you lost through your own mismanagement." Caleb's hand moved to rest on his gun belt, not threateningly, but noticeably. "That is a lie, and you know it, Carson." The sheriff's face reddened. "Are you threatening an officer of the law?" "I am stating a fact. Charlotte Nolan has not stolen anything. Those charges are fraudulent, designed to give Thornton legal cover to seize her property." If you try to arrest her, I will personally ensure that the territorial authorities hear every detail of your corruption." Carson took a step back, clearly not expecting such direct opposition. "You are making a big mistake, Vaughn. Thornton is not a man you want as an enemy." "Neither am I," Caleb said quietly, and something in his tone made the sheriff reconsider whatever he had been about to say. "This is not over," Carson muttered before turning and walking away. Charlotte let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "He will be back with more men." "Probably," Caleb agreed, "which is why we are not going back to my ranch just yet. We are going to pay a visit to someone who might be able to help us." He led her to the edge of town, to a small house surrounded by a neat garden. An older Mexican woman answered Caleb's knock, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Caleb, it has been too long." "Señora Alvarez," Caleb greeted her warmly, removing his hat. "I need to speak with your husband if he is available." "Of course, come in, come in." Inside, they found Tomás Alvarez, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s who had been a lawyer before retiring to Gila City. He listened intently as Caleb and Charlotte explained the situation, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "What Thornton is doing is illegal on multiple levels," Tomás said thoughtfully. "But proving it in a court controlled by his family will be nearly impossible. However, if we can get the case moved to a different jurisdiction, you would have a fighting chance." "How do we do that?" Charlotte asked. "The telegram you sent to the territorial governor was a good start. If we can also get affidavits from people who have witnessed Thornton's crimes, and if we can prove the documents he claims show your father's debt are forgeries, we can petition for a change of venue. It will take time, but it is your best option." "Time is something we might not have," Caleb pointed out. "Thornton is going to escalate. He already has a false warrant out for Charlotte's arrest." Tomás nodded gravely. "Then you need to make sure Charlotte stays somewhere safe while we gather evidence, and you need to be prepared for violence. Men like Thornton do not give up easily." They left the Alvarez home with renewed purpose. Tomás had agreed to start preparing the legal case, and he promised to reach out to people who might be willing to testify against Thornton. It was dangerous for anyone to stand up to the man, but Tomás had connections in the Mexican community that Thornton had also abused over the years. Perhaps some of them would be brave enough to speak up if they knew others were doing the same. Caleb and Charlotte rode back toward his ranch, taking a longer route to avoid any potential ambush. Along the way, Charlotte finally asked the question that had been on her mind since the previous day. "Your oath," she said quietly. "When did you make it?" Caleb was silent for a long moment, and Charlotte thought he might not answer. Then he began to speak, his voice heavy with old pain. 5 years ago, there was a range war between two cattle barons. They both wanted the same grazing land, and they did not care who got hurt in the crossfire. My mother lived in a small cabin on that disputed land. She had been there for 20 years, long before either of them showed up. I was working a ranch 2 counties over, sending her money every month, planning to bring her to live with me once I saved enough to buy my own place." He paused, his jaw tightening. "One of the barons decided to burn out everyone on that land to make his claim clear. My mother tried to flee, but she did not make it. By the time I got word and rode home, she was already buried. The men who did it were never punished because the baron who ordered it had powerful friends. I stood over her grave and swore that I would never let another innocent person suffer like she did if I had the power to prevent it." Charlotte felt tears sting her eyes. "I am so sorry, Caleb." "That oath is the only thing that gives her death meaning," Caleb continued. "If I can use my skills, my ranch, my resources to protect people who cannot protect themselves, then maybe her death was not entirely in vain. That is why I helped you yesterday, and that is why I will see this through to the end. Not for glory or profit, but because that oath is the most important promise I have ever made. It must be a heavy burden to carry alone, Charlotte said softly. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since making that oath, he felt the weight of it shift slightly. Maybe it does not have to be alone anymore. The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken possibilities, until Charlotte smiled. Then we will carry it together, at least until Thornton is dealt with. At least until then, Caleb agreed, though both of them wondered if it might be longer than that. When they arrived back at the ranch, Diego was waiting with news. He had taken 4 men to the Triple N ranch and found it in disarray. Thornton's men had been there, killing several head of cattle and burning one of the barns. But Diego and the others had chased them off, and were now fortifying the property as best they could. They will be back, Diego reported. But we will be ready for them. Good, Caleb said. Double the watches and make sure everyone is armed. No one goes anywhere alone. Over the following days, a pattern emerged. Thornton's men would probe the defenses at the Triple N ranch, testing for weaknesses but retreating when met with organized resistance. Meanwhile, Tomás Alvarez worked tirelessly to build a legal case, and slowly, witnesses began to come forward. Ranch hands who had been forced to participate in Thornton's schemes, shopkeepers who had been intimidated into silence, Mexican families whose land had been stolen through similar tactics years earlier. Each affidavit, each piece of testimony, added to the growing pile of evidence. But it also increased the danger. 2 of the witnesses were beaten by unknown assailants, though they survived and refused to recant their statements. The telegraph office reported that someone had tried to intercept messages between Gila City and the territorial capital. The pressure was building toward an inevitable confrontation. Through it all, Caleb and Charlotte grew closer. They worked side by side during the day, planning strategy and managing the 2 ranches. In the evenings, they would sit on Caleb's porch, talking about everything from their childhoods to their dreams for the future. Charlotte told him about growing up with only her father for company, about learning to rope and brand before she could read, about the loneliness of being a woman in a man's world. Caleb shared memories of his mother, of the lessons she had taught him about honor and compassion, about how she had always believed that one person could make a difference if they were willing to pay the price. He told Charlotte about the years after her death, about how he had drifted from job to job, using his skills with horses and cattle to earn money, but feeling empty inside until he made his oath and bought his ranch. You ever regret it? Charlotte asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and red. The oath, I mean. It must limit your freedom in many ways. Caleb considered the question seriously. I used to think freedom meant having no obligations, no ties. But I learned that kind of freedom is just another word for loneliness. The oath gives my life purpose. It connects me to something larger than myself. That is worth more than the illusion of unlimited choice. You are a remarkable man, Caleb Vaughn, Charlotte said, and the admiration in her voice was unmistakable. He turned to look at her, and in the fading light she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with mere physical appearance. It was the beauty of strength tempered with kindness, of courage born from adversity, of a spirit that refused to be broken. You are remarkable yourself, Charlotte Nolan, he replied. Most people would have given up by now, taken whatever they could get and fled. You are still fighting. I learned from my father that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The land, our name, our dignity. Those are not things you can just abandon. She paused, then added quietly, And now I have another reason to fight. I do not want to leave you." The confession hung in the air between them, as real and solid as the adobe walls of the house behind them. Caleb felt his heart hammering in his chest, a sensation he had not experienced in years. He wanted to reach for her, to pull her close and promise that she would never have to leave, but his oath held him back. He had sworn to help her, to protect her, not to complicate her life with his own emotions. "Charlotte," he began, but she held up a hand. "You do not have to say anything. I just wanted you to know how I feel. Whatever happens with Thornton, whatever the future holds, I am grateful that I found you, that you kept your oath even when it meant risking your own safety." Before Caleb could respond, Diego came running up to the porch, his face urgent. "Riders approaching, at least a dozen of them. They are coming fast." Caleb and Charlotte were on their feet instantly. "Get everyone armed and inside the house," Caleb ordered. "Close the shutters and be ready for anything." Within minutes, the ranch had transformed into a fortress. Men took positions at windows, rifles loaded and ready. Maria and the other women prepared medical supplies and extra ammunition. Charlotte stood beside Caleb at the front window, her own rifle in hand, her face set with determination. The riders came to a halt about 50 yards from the house, well within shooting range but far enough to avoid immediate conflict. In the fading light, Caleb could make out Marcus Thornton himself at the head of the group, sitting tall on a black stallion. He was a handsome man in his 40s, well-dressed and clean-shaven, with the kind of polished appearance that came from wealth and privilege. But his eyes, even at this distance, were cold and calculating. "Vaughn," Thornton called out, "send out Charlotte Nolan. She has a warrant out for her arrest, and I am here to collect her on behalf of the sheriff." "Since when does a private citizen collect wanted criminals?" Caleb shouted back. "If Carson wants her, he can come himself. Carson is busy. I am acting as a deputized agent. Show me the paperwork." Thornton's expression darkened even in the dim light. "You are making this harder than it needs to be. The woman is a criminal and a debtor. Give her up, and there will be no trouble." "The only criminal here is you," Charlotte called out, stepping into view. "You murdered my father and forged documents to steal my land. But it is not going to work. We have evidence, witnesses, and the territorial authorities are already investigating." Thornton's horse shifted nervously, sensing its rider's agitation. "You stupid girl, you could have had everything. I offered you marriage, wealth, respect. Instead, you chose this." He gestured dismissively at Caleb's ranch, hiding behind a man with delusions of heroism. "He is worth 10 of you," Charlotte shot back. "Perhaps," Thornton said coldly, "but I have more men." "Vaughn, you have until tomorrow at noon to hand her over. After that, we will come take her, and anyone who stands in our way will be considered an outlaw. I have friends in high places who will support my actions." "And I have the law on my side," Caleb replied. "The real law, not your purchased version of it. Come back tomorrow if you want, but you will not take her while I am alive." Thornton stared at him for a long moment, then smiled without humor. "That can be arranged." He wheeled his horse around, and his men followed, disappearing into the growing darkness. As soon as they were gone, Caleb turned to Diego. "Send a rider to the Triple N. Pull everyone back here. We cannot defend 2 locations, and Thornton will attack whichever one seems weaker." "Already done," Diego confirmed. "I sent word as soon as I saw them coming." That night, no one slept much. They took turns on watch, knowing that Thornton might not wait until noon to make his move. Caleb found Charlotte in the kitchen around midnight, making coffee for the men on duty. "You should rest," he told her gently. "I cannot sleep knowing that people are risking their lives because of me," she replied. Your men, Maria, Diego, all of them could just walk away, but they are staying. Because of you. Because you inspired that kind of loyalty. They are staying because it is the right thing to do. They know what Thornton represents, what kind of future awaits everyone if men like him are allowed to operate unchecked. Charlotte poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Caleb. When this is over, assuming we survive, I want you to know something. What is that? I have fallen in love with you, she said simply. I did not plan for it to happen, and I know the timing is terrible, but I needed to say it, in case tomorrow goes badly. Caleb set down his coffee cup, his hands trembling slightly. Charlotte, I cannot. My oath, it requires me to help people without expectation of reward or personal gain. If I tell you how I feel, if I let this become about us instead of about protecting you, then I am violating everything I swore to uphold. That is ridiculous, Charlotte said, but her voice was gentle, not angry. Your oath was to help the innocent, not to sentence yourself to a life alone. You are allowed to care for the people you protect. You are allowed to be human. But what if my feelings cloud my judgment? What if I make a decision based on what I want instead of what is right? Charlotte reached out and took his hand. Then you make that decision and live with the consequences. Caleb, you have spent 5 years honoring your mother's memory through sacrifice and service. Do you really think she would want you to deny yourself happiness forever? The question hit him like a physical blow. His mother had been the most loving, life-affirming person he had ever known. She had always encouraged him to find joy, to build a family, to create a legacy beyond mere survival. Would she really want him to use her death as an excuse to avoid emotional connection? I do not know how to do this, he admitted quietly. For so long, the oath has been everything. I do not know how to balance it with feelings like this. Maybe you do not have to balance it, Charlotte suggested. Maybe you can integrate it. The oath does not have to be separate from the rest of your life. It can be part of it, woven into everything you do, including loving someone. Before Caleb could respond, shots rang out from the direction of the barn. They both ran to the front of the house, where Diego was already shouting orders. Thornton had not waited until noon. His men were trying to burn the barn, using the distraction to get closer to the house. Caleb grabbed his rifle and took up a position at the window. Hold your fire until they are in range, he commanded. Make every shot count. The next hour was chaos. Thornton's men attacked in waves, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. But Caleb's ranch was well designed for defense, with thick walls and limited approaches, and his men were skilled shooters who did not waste ammunition. 3 of Thornton's men went down in the first assault, and the rest fell back to regroup. During the lull, Charlotte reloaded weapons while Maria tended to a ranch hand who had taken a bullet in the arm. The wound was not serious, but it showed how real the danger had become. This was no longer intimidation or legal maneuvering. This was war. They will try again before dawn, Caleb predicted. They want to finish this in the dark. He was right. Just before sunrise, Thornton launched a more coordinated assault, with some men providing covering fire while others tried to rush the house. But in the growing light, they made easier targets, and the defenders drove them back with steady, disciplined fire. 2 more of Thornton's men fell, and the rest retreated out of rifle range. As the sun rose fully above the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, an unexpected sound reached them. Hoofbeats, many of them, coming from the direction of town. Caleb tensed, wondering if Thornton had called in reinforcements, but then he saw the riders clearly and felt a surge of relief. At the head of the group was a man in a black suit with a silver star pinned to his vest. A United States Marshal. Behind him rode a dozen deputies, and behind them, a full company of cavalry from Fort Huachuca. The territorial governor had not just sent an investigator. He had sent an army. The marshal rode up to where Thornton and his remaining men were regrouping. Even from the house, Caleb could see the conversation, though he could not hear the words. Thornton was gesturing angrily, clearly trying to assert his authority, but the marshal was unmoved. After a few minutes, the marshal drew his gun and pointed it at Thornton, and several deputies moved in to disarm Thornton's men. "It is over," Charlotte whispered, barely able to believe what she was seeing. "It is actually over." Caleb put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Not quite. We still have to make sure the law finishes what we started." The marshal rode up to the house, and Caleb went out to meet him. The man was in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen every kind of human behavior. He introduced himself as Marshal Frank Coughlin. "Mr. Vaughn, Miss Nolan," he greeted them. "The territorial governor received your telegram and found it concerning enough to investigate. What we discovered in the past few days confirmed everything you alleged. Marcus Thornton is under arrest for murder, fraud, intimidation, and a host of other charges. His cousin the judge has been suspended pending investigation, and Sheriff Carson is also in custody." Charlotte felt her knees go weak, and Caleb steadied her. "My father," she said. "Can you prove Thornton killed him?" Coughlin nodded gravely. "One of his men turned witness in exchange for leniency. He will testify that Thornton ordered your father's death when he refused to sell his land. Combined with the forged documents and the testimony of other victims, we have more than enough to convict." "What about my ranch?" Charlotte asked. "Is it safe?" "Your title is clear and undisputed. All of Thornton's claims have been invalidated. Your property is yours free and clear." Relief flooded through Charlotte so powerfully that she had to lean against Caleb to stay upright. He held her, not caring what anyone else might think, feeling his own relief mixing with a joy he had not expected. They had won. Against all odds, against money and corruption and violence, they had won. Over the following weeks, the legal process unfolded with satisfying efficiency. Thornton and his associates were tried in a court presided over by a judge brought in from another territory to ensure impartiality. The evidence was overwhelming, and the verdict was never in doubt. Thornton was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison, while several of his men received shorter sentences. Sheriff Carson and Judge Thornton were both removed from office and faced their own legal consequences. Charlotte's ranch was restored to her, and with Caleb's help, she began the work of rebuilding. The barn that had been burned was replaced with a larger, more modern structure. Cattle that had been stolen were recovered or replaced. Workers who had fled in fear returned when they learned it was safe. But the most significant rebuilding happened between Caleb and Charlotte themselves. With the immediate danger past, they had time to explore the feelings that had developed during those intense days of crisis. Caleb struggled at first, still uncertain how to reconcile his oath with his love for Charlotte, but she was patient with him, helping him understand that loving her did not diminish his commitment to helping others. In fact, she pointed out one evening as they rode the boundary between their two properties, "Loving me strengthens your oath, because now you have even more reason to fight for a world where justice prevails and the innocent are protected. You are not just fighting for abstract principles anymore. You are fighting for the life we could build together." Caleb looked at her, this remarkable woman who had challenged everything he thought he knew about himself, and realized she was right. His oath did not require him to be alone. It required him to be good, to be just, to stand against wrongdoing. He could do all of that and still love Charlotte Nolan with every fiber of his being. "Marry me," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could overthink them. Not because you need my protection anymore, but because I need you. Because you make me better than I am alone. Because I want to spend the rest of my life proving that my oath and my love are not in conflict. Charlotte's face lit up with a smile that rivaled the Arizona sun. Yes. Yes. 1,000 times yes. They were married 2 months later in a ceremony that brought together the diverse community they had both fought to protect. Mexican families who had been victims of Thornton's earlier land grabs attended alongside Anglo ranchers who had admired Caleb's stand. The cavalry captain who had led the troops from Fort Huachuca came, as did Marshal Coughlin. Tomás Alvarez served as one of the witnesses, proud of the role his legal work had played in achieving justice. Maria cried throughout the ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Diego stood beside Caleb as his best man. The local priest, Father Miguel, presided over the service with genuine joy, having seen too many stories end in tragedy and being grateful that this one had found happiness. Charlotte wore a simple white dress that Maria had helped her sew, with lace borrowed from one of the Mexican women in town. She had never looked more beautiful. Caleb wore his best suit, the one he usually reserved for church on the rare occasions he attended, and tried not to let his hands shake as he slipped the ring onto Charlotte's finger. When Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed Charlotte with a tenderness that belied his rough exterior, and everyone cheered. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and food that represented the mixing of cultures that made the Arizona territory such a vibrant place. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Caleb and Charlotte stood together on the porch of what was now their shared home, having decided to combine the two ranches into one larger operation. The Triple N and Caleb's ranch would operate as a single entity, managed by both of them with Diego's help. "Are you happy?" Caleb asked, pulling Charlotte close. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied. "Especially considering how we met." "Sometimes the worst circumstances lead to the best outcomes," Caleb mused. "If Thornton had not threatened you, if you had not needed help, we might never have found each other." "You still think about your oath, about whether loving me conflicts with it?" Caleb shook his head. "Not anymore. You helped me understand that the oath was never meant to be a prison. It was meant to be a guiding principle, a North Star to navigate by. And now, instead of navigating alone, I have you beside me. We will keep helping people," Charlotte said firmly. "Both of us together." Other ranchers facing threats, families being pushed off their land, anyone who needs someone to stand with them. Your oath does not end just because we got married. It expands to include both of us. Caleb felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the desert heat. "I love you, Charlotte Vaughn." She smiled at the sound of her new name. "I love you too, Caleb Vaughn, and I release you from your oath." He pulled back, startled. "What? Your oath, the one you made on your mother's grave? You swore that only I could release you from it, so I am releasing you. Not because I want you to stop helping people, but because I want you to do it freely, as a choice you make every day, not as a burden you carry from the past." Caleb stared at her, speechless. The oath had been the center of his existence for 5 years, the framework around which he had built his entire identity. The thought of being released from it was both terrifying and exhilarating. But as he looked into Charlotte's eyes, he realized she was giving him the greatest gift possible, the freedom to choose his path rather than being bound to it. "I do not need to be released," he said slowly, "because I choose to keep helping people, not because I swore to, but because it is right. Because it is who I am. You have not freed me from the oath, Charlotte. You have helped me understand that I was never really bound by it. I was living it freely all along, and I will continue to do so. But now, I will do it with you beside me." Charlotte kissed him again, slower this time, and in that kiss was the promise of all the years to come. The years that followed were rich and full. Caleb and Charlotte built their ranch into one of the most successful in the territory, known not just for the quality of their cattle, but for their fair treatment of workers and their willingness to help neighboring ranchers through hard times. They became known as people to turn to when trouble arose, when justice was needed, when someone had nowhere else to go. True to Charlotte's words on their wedding night, the oath expanded to include both of them. They stood together against cattle rustlers, helped Mexican families file legal claims to land that had been stolen, provided loans to ranchers facing drought or disease, and even testified in court against corrupt officials when necessary. Their reputation grew, and with it, their influence. Territorial authorities began consulting them on matters of range management and dispute resolution. They became, in effect, the conscience of the region, but they also built a personal life that was warm and loving. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Charlotte's father, was born 18 months after their wedding. He had Charlotte's dark eyes and Caleb's strong jaw, and from the moment he entered the world, he was adored. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, named Grace after Caleb's mother. She had her grandmother's gentle spirit and her father's determination, a combination that promised she would be a force to be reckoned with. Maria doted on the children as if they were her own grandchildren, teaching them Spanish alongside English and filling their days with stories and laughter. Diego's own family grew as well, and the ranch became a place where multiple generations worked and played together, creating a community that felt more like family than employees. On quiet evenings, Caleb would sometimes walk up the hill to his mother's grave, now surrounded by wildflowers that Charlotte had planted. He would stand there, as he had on the day he made his oath, but now his thoughts were different. Instead of pain and anger, he felt gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons his mother had taught him, for the path those lessons had set him on, and for the woman who had helped him understand that honoring the dead did not require sacrificing the living. "I kept my promise, Ma," he would say softly, "but I also found happiness." "I hope that makes you glad. Charlotte thinks it would, and I have learned to trust her judgment." One evening, about 7 years after they married, Caleb and Charlotte sat on their porch watching the sunset while their children played in the yard under Maria's watchful eye. The ranch was thriving, the territory was becoming more civilized with each passing year, and they had just received word that a nearby family facing foreclosure would be helped by a new law they had lobbied the territorial legislature to pass. "You ever think about that day we met?" Charlotte asked, her head resting on Caleb's shoulder. "When I came riding up with Thornton's men chasing me, all the time," Caleb admitted. "It was the day everything changed. You could have turned me away, let me deal with my problems on my own. Instead, you risked everything to help a stranger. It was not a choice. The oath demanded it, and my heart agreed with the oath. Looking back, I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw the determination in your eyes. You were scared but still fighting. That kind of courage is rare." Charlotte smiled. "I fell in love with you when you stood between me and those men without hesitation. I knew then that I had found someone extraordinary, someone whose word meant something, whose promises were not empty. In a world full of men who take and take, you were someone who gave. We give together now," Caleb corrected. "That is the best part. Every decision, every stand we take, we do it as partners." "Speaking of which," Charlotte said with a mischievous glint in her eye, "I heard that the Reynolds family over by the border is having trouble with bandits. The sheriff is too far away to help, and they have young children to protect. Caleb sighed, but he was smiling. I suppose we should ride over there tomorrow and see what we can do. I suppose we should, Charlotte agreed. After all, we made a promise to help people who cannot help themselves. I made that promise, Caleb pointed out. You just married into it. No, Charlotte said firmly. I chose it, just like you did. Your oath became my oath the day we married, and I would not have it any other way. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Their children's laughter drifted up from the yard, mixing with the evening sounds of the ranch, horses nickering, cattle lowing in the distance, the wind rustling through the cottonwood trees along the river. Caleb thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the depths of grief and anger to this moment of peace and purpose. His mother would be proud, he knew, not just of the oath he had kept, but of the life he had built while keeping it. He had proven that you could be both strong and gentle, both justice-minded and loving, both committed to a cause and open to joy. The Reynolds family turned out to need more than just protection from bandits. They needed food, supplies, and help repairing their ranch after a raid had destroyed their barn and scattered their livestock. Caleb and Charlotte organized a community effort, bringing together neighboring ranchers to contribute what they could. Within a week, the Reynolds family was back on their feet, and the bandits had been driven off by the show of unified strength. It was the kind of problem-solving that had become characteristic of how Caleb and Charlotte operated. They understood that true help was not just about gunfights and dramatic rescues. It was about building communities where people supported each other, where the strong helped the weak not out of obligation, but out of recognition that everyone was better off when everyone was secure. As the years continued to pass, Caleb and Charlotte added another child to their family, a second son they named Diego after their trusted friend and foreman. By the time Thomas was 10, Grace was 8, and young Diego was 4, the ranch had expanded to become one of the largest operations in the southern Arizona territory. But more importantly, it had become a model for how ranches could operate ethically and profitably at the same time. Workers were paid fair wages, families were housed in decent homes, children had access to education through a school Charlotte had helped establish in Gila City, and disputes were resolved through discussion, rather than violence whenever possible. It was the kind of place Caleb's mother would have loved, and he often told his children stories about their grandmother, making sure they understood where the values that guided their family came from. Thomas, as the eldest, showed an early interest in the ranch work, often riding alongside his father and learning the skills needed to manage cattle and land. Grace was more interested in the legal and community aspects of what her parents did, and Charlotte began teaching her about property law and dispute resolution. Young Diego was still too small to know what he wanted, but he had his father's quiet determination and his mother's sharp intelligence, a combination that promised great things. On Thomas's 12th birthday, Caleb took him up to Grace's grave for the first time. The boy had heard stories about his grandmother all his life, but this was the first time he was old enough to really understand the significance of the place. I made a promise here, Caleb told his son, explaining the oath in detail. A promise that shaped everything that came after. Your mother, your life, everything started because I stood here and decided that my grief would not be wasted. Do I have to make a promise too? Thomas asked, his young face serious. Caleb smiled and shook his head. The oath was mine, not yours. You will have to find your own path, your own promises. But I hope you will learn from mine. Not the specific words, but the principle behind them. that we have a responsibility to use whatever power we have to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Like you did with Mother when Thornton was after her. Exactly like that. Sometimes helping people means fighting, but more often it means standing beside them, giving them the support and resources they need to fight for themselves. Your mother taught me that. I was ready to do all the fighting alone, but she showed me that true strength comes from building communities where everyone looks out for each other. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. I want to be like you and Mother when I grow up. Then be yourself, Caleb advised. Your mother and I are not perfect. We have made mistakes, lost our tempers, made decisions we regretted. What matters is that we tried to do right more often than we did wrong, and when we failed, we learned from it. That is all anyone can do. They stood together in silence for a while. 3 generations connected by love and loss and the promise to make the world a little better than they found it. Then they walked back down the hill together, where Charlotte was waiting with the rest of the family, ready to celebrate Thomas's birthday with food and music, and the kind of joy that Grace Vaughn would have cherished. When Caleb and Charlotte had been married for 15 years, the territory achieved statehood, becoming Arizona in 1896. By then, their children were nearly grown. Thomas was a capable young man of 17, already taking on significant responsibilities in managing the ranch. Grace was 15, brilliant and passionate, already talking about becoming a lawyer like Tomás Alvarez, who had become a mentor to her. Young Diego was 12, still finding his way but showing signs of inheriting his parents' compassion and determination. The statehood celebration in Gila City was massive, with people coming from all over the new state to participate. Caleb and Charlotte were invited to sit on the platform with other prominent citizens, a recognition of how much they had contributed to the region's development. As they watched the ceremony, Charlotte leaned over and whispered to Caleb, "Your mother would be so proud. Look at what her death set in motion, not just our family but all of this. The schools, the fair courts, the communities where people help each other. It all traces back to the oath you made on her grave." Caleb squeezed her hand. "We made it together. You are the one who showed me how to live the oath without being consumed by it. Everything good in my life came from you." "Everything good came from both of us choosing to care about more than just ourselves," Charlotte corrected. "That is what your mother taught you, and it is what we are teaching our children." As the governor of the new state gave his speech, talking about the values that would guide Arizona into the future, Caleb reflected on his journey. From a grief-stricken son standing over a fresh grave to a husband, father, and respected member of the community, he had traveled far. The oath had been his compass, but Charlotte had been his destination. Together, they had built something that mattered, something that would outlast them both. That night, after the celebrations had wound down and they had returned to the ranch, Caleb found Charlotte in their bedroom, brushing out her hair by lamplight. He watched her for a moment, still amazed after all these years that she was his wife, his partner, his love. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, catching his reflection in the mirror. "I am thinking about the day we met, about how close I came to missing you. If I had been working a different part of the ranch that day, if you had ridden a different direction, our paths might never have crossed." "But they did cross," Charlotte said, turning to face him. "And I do not believe that was an accident. You made a promise to help people who needed it, and I needed help. The universe has a way of bringing together the people who are meant to find each other." Caleb crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "I love you, Charlotte Vaughn. Every day I wake up grateful that you rode into my life." "I love you too," she replied, resting her head against his chest. "And I am grateful that you had the courage to make that oath, to stand by it, and to let me share it with you." They held each other as the lamp burned low, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. Outside, the Arizona night was vast and star-filled, the same sky that had witnessed Caleb's oath 15 years earlier. But where that day had been about pain and loss, this night was about love and fulfillment. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of challenges and joys. Thomas married a young woman from a neighboring ranch when he was 22, bringing new energy and ideas to the family operation. Grace did indeed become a lawyer, one of the first women to practice law in Arizona, and she used her skills to continue her parents' work of protecting the vulnerable and challenging injustice. Diego found his calling as a teacher, establishing schools in remote areas where children had never had access to education. All three children absorbed the lessons their parents had taught, each expressing those lessons in their own unique way. They understood that privilege came with responsibility, that power should be used to protect rather than exploit, and that the measure of a life was not in what you accumulated, but in what you gave away. Caleb and Charlotte grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces acquiring lines that spoke of years spent outdoors and countless smiles shared. They remained active in the ranch and the community well into their 60s, though they gradually turned over more responsibilities to Thomas and his growing family. One evening, when Caleb was 68 and Charlotte was 65, they rode out together to the hill where Grace's grave stood. It had become a ritual over the years, visiting that spot whenever they had important decisions to make or simply needed to reconnect with the foundation of their life together. "You remember the day I released you from your oath?" Charlotte asked as they sat side by side on the grass. "Of course, it was our wedding night. You said I could choose freely rather than being bound. And you said you chose to keep living by the oath anyway, that you would continue helping people because it was who you were, not because you were obligated." "It is still true," Caleb confirmed. "Even now, even at this age, I look for ways to make things better. It is in my bones," Charlotte smiled. "Mine too. We have had a good life, Caleb, better than either of us could have imagined when we met." "The best life," he agreed, "because we lived it together." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the Arizona sky in those familiar shades of orange and red. From this vantage point, they could see the ranch sprawling below them, now home to 3 generations of Vaughns and the many families who worked alongside them. They could see Gila City in the distance, grown from a small frontier town into a thriving community. They could see the land they had protected, the people they had helped, the legacy they had built. "Your mother would be proud," Charlotte said again, as she had said so many times over the years. "I know," Caleb replied, "because I can feel it. Every time we stand here, every time I remember that day I made the oath, I feel her presence. Not in a ghostly way, but in the way certain truths feel permanent and real. She lives on in the choices I made, in the life we built, in our children and their children." "That is the best kind of immortality," Charlotte observed. "Not in being remembered, but in shaping the future through the values you pass on." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they rode back down to the ranch together, their horses moving in the synchronized way that comes from decades of riding side by side. The house was lit up and welcoming, filled with the sounds of family. Grandchildren playing, Thomas discussing business with his wife, Grace preparing legal briefs at the kitchen table, Diego grading papers from his students. Caleb and Charlotte entered this warm chaos, and it felt like coming home in the deepest sense. This was what the oath had been for. Not just to fight against evil, but to create spaces where good could flourish. Not just to prevent harm, but to nurture growth. Not just to defend the vulnerable, but to help them become strong. That night, Lying in bed with Charlotte beside him, Caleb thought about the young man he had been, standing over his mother's grave with nothing but grief and rage. If he could speak to that young man now, what would he say? That the pain would fade, that the anger would transform into purpose, that he would find love and meaning beyond anything he could currently imagine. All of that was true, but the most important truth was simpler, that keeping faith with the dead did not require abandoning the living. That honoring loss did not mean refusing joy, that an oath made in darkness could light the way to incredible brightness. Charlotte stirred beside him, and without waking, she moved closer, her body fitting against his with the perfect familiarity of decades shared. Caleb put his arm around her and closed his eyes, grateful for this moment and every moment that had led to it. The oath had been the beginning of his journey, but Charlotte had been its fulfillment. Together, they had proven that one person's promise, born from tragedy, could ripple outward to create waves of positive change. That love and justice were not opposing forces, but complementary ones. That the strongest chains were not those that bound you, but those you chose freely. As Caleb drifted off to sleep, his last thought was of his mother's face, smiling with the pride and love she had always shown him. The oath was kept, the promise fulfilled, and the legacy secured. Everything else was grace. Years continued to pass with the gentle inevitability of desert seasons. Caleb and Charlotte celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The ranch had grown into an institution, known throughout Arizona not just as a successful business, but as a place where values mattered as much as profits. When Caleb was 75, he finally stopped riding out to check fences and manage cattle, though he still consulted on major decisions and loved nothing more than spending time with his grandchildren, telling them stories about the old days. Charlotte remained active longer, her sharp mind and passionate advocacy continuing to influence state politics and legal reforms well into her 70s. On a warm spring evening, not long after Caleb's 78th birthday, he and Charlotte sat on their porch watching the sunset one more time. Their hands were intertwined, their bodies leaning against each other with the ease of a lifetime spent together. "You have any regrets?" Charlotte asked suddenly. Caleb considered the question seriously, as he did all her questions. "No, not one. Every choice I made, every path I took led me here. To you, to our family, to this life. How could I regret any of it, even the hard parts? The fights, the losses, the times we nearly failed, especially those parts," Caleb said firmly. "They taught us what mattered. They showed us what we were capable of. Without the challenges, the victories would mean nothing." Charlotte nodded, satisfied. "I feel the same way. I used to think my life was over when my father died and Thornton came after me. Instead, it was just beginning. The real beginning, the part that mattered. You saved me as much as I saved you," Caleb told her, a truth he had expressed many times but never tired of saying. "I was drowning in that oath, letting it consume me. You showed me how to live with it instead of for it." "We saved each other," Charlotte corrected gently. "That is what love does. It does not rescue, it reinforces. It does not take over, it stands alongside." As the last light faded from the sky, their grandchildren came out to help them inside, young hands supporting old bodies with tender care. The house was still filled with life and noise and purpose, exactly as it had been for decades. That night, Caleb dreamed of his mother. She was young and healthy, the way she had been in his earliest memories, and she was smiling at him with pure joy. "You kept your promise," she said, and her voice was as clear as if she stood beside him. "But more than that, you found happiness. You built a legacy of love and justice. I am so proud of you, Caleb." "I did it for you," he said in the dream, "No," she replied gently. "You did it for yourself and for Charlotte and for everyone you helped along the way. My death was the catalyst, but you were the agent. Never forget that. The power was always yours." When Caleb woke, he found Charlotte watching him in the pre-dawn darkness. "You were smiling in your sleep," she said. "I was dreaming about my mother." She said she was proud. "Of course she is. How could she not be?" Charlotte paused, then added, "Caleb, I need to tell you something." He heard the seriousness in her voice and pushed himself up to sitting, concern flooding through him. "What is it?" "Nothing bad," she assured him quickly. "Just something I have been thinking about. We are not going to live forever. In fact, we have probably lived more years than we have left. And I want to make sure you know that when the time comes, the oath dies with you. Do not pass it to our children as a burden. Let them find their own paths, their own promises." Caleb reached for her hand. "I already decided that years ago. The oath was mine, born from my specific loss and my specific need to find meaning in it. Thomas and Grace and Diego have their own values, their own purposes. They do not need mine." "Good," Charlotte said with relief. "I wanted to be sure. Your oath gave us everything, but it belongs to our generation, not theirs." "Agreed. Though I think they will continue the work in their own ways. We raised them to care about justice and compassion. They will find ways to express those values that fit their lives." "That is all we can ask," Charlotte said, settling back against the pillows. "That the principles survive even if the specific promises evolve." They lay together in the growing light, two people who had weathered every storm life threw at them and emerged stronger. The oath that had brought them together had long since transformed from a burden into a blessing, from a chain into a choice, from an obligation into an opportunity. When Caleb was 81 and Charlotte was 78, they both knew their time was growing short. They spent more time sitting together in quiet contemplation, less time engaged in the frenetic activity that had characterized their younger years. But their minds remained sharp, and their love remained as deep as ever. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch, Thomas came to them with news. "There is a family in Tucson, recent immigrants from Mexico, being threatened by a developer who wants their land. They heard about you, about what you did for people over the years. They are asking for help." Caleb and Charlotte exchanged a long look. They were too old to ride into danger themselves, but that had never been the only way to help. "What do they need?" Charlotte asked. "Legal representation and protection. The developer is using the same tactics Thornton used: false debt claims, intimidation, violence." "Contact Grace," Charlotte said immediately. "She will handle the legal side. And Thomas, I want you to make it clear that this family has our support. Publicly. Let everyone know that the Vaughn family stands with them. And set up a fund," Caleb added, "for their legal fees, for protection if they need to hire guards, for whatever else is required. Use our money if necessary." Thomas smiled. "I will take care of it. I thought you would want to help." "Always," Caleb said firmly. "As long as we draw breath, we help. That is who we are." After Thomas left to make the arrangements, Charlotte took Caleb's hand. "The oath continues. In a different form, but yes, it continues. Good. I would hate to think we spent all these years building something that would disappear when we are gone." "It will not disappear," Caleb assured her. "It is in our children, our grandchildren, in the example we set. The specific oath I made on my mother's grave might be personal, but the spirit behind it is universal. That will endure." And it did. The family in Tucson was successfully defended, the developer's schemes exposed and thwarted. Grace's legal work was brilliant, and the public support from the Vaughn family made it impossible for corrupt officials to look the other way. It was not the same as Caleb riding to rescue Charlotte all those years ago, but it was equally effective. As autumn arrived in Arizona, bringing cooler temperatures and the year's gentlest weather, Caleb and Charlotte celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. The celebration was enormous, with people coming from all over Arizona and beyond to honor them. Former governors, judges, ranchers, families they had helped over the decades, all gathered to express their gratitude and respect. During the party, Thomas stood and gave a speech that brought tears to many eyes. "My parents taught us that power is meaningless unless it is used to protect others. They showed us that an oath is not a limitation but a liberation, because it focuses your energy on what truly matters. They proved that love and justice are not separate pursuits, but two aspects of the same commitment to making the world better than you found it." He raised his glass. "To Caleb and Charlotte Vaughn, who kept their promises and showed us all what it means to live with purpose." "To Caleb and Charlotte," the crowd echoed, and the sound of it rolled across the ranch like thunder. That night, alone in their room after the last guest had departed, Caleb and Charlotte held each other close. 50 years, Charlotte marveled. "It seems like both forever and no time at all." "Every year was a gift," Caleb said. "Every day with you was better than I deserved." "You deserved everything good," Charlotte insisted, as she had insisted countless times before. "You earned it through your choices, your sacrifices, your unwavering commitment to doing right." "We earned it together," Caleb corrected, and she did not argue because it was true. They fell asleep in each other's arms, as they had done nearly every night for 50 years, and when they woke the next morning, they woke together, ready to face whatever time they had left. Caleb lived to see his 85th birthday, a remarkable age for someone who had lived such an active, demanding life. His body had finally begun to fail, though his mind remained clear until the very end. On a quiet morning in early spring, with Charlotte holding his hand and all their children gathered around, he passed peacefully from the world. His last words were, "I kept the promise. Tell my mother I kept the promise." "She knows," Charlotte whispered through her tears. "She has always known." Caleb Vaughn was buried on the hill next to his mother, under a stone that read, "He made an oath and kept it. He found love and shared it. He left the world better than he found it." Charlotte lived another 3 years, continuing to advocate for justice and reform even as her own health declined. She spoke often of Caleb, keeping his memory alive not through grief, but through celebration of what they had built together. When she finally joined him, she was buried on his other side, the three of them together at last. The mother whose death had inspired the oath, the son who had lived by it, and the woman who had shown him how to transform it from burden into blessing. The ranch continued under Thomas's management, then under his sons, and eventually under his granddaughters. Each generation adapted to the times, but they never forgot the principles that Caleb and Charlotte had established. The Vaughn name became synonymous with integrity, fairness, and a commitment to helping those who could not help themselves. Decades after Caleb's death, long after everyone who had known him personally was gone, stories about him still circulated in Arizona. The details were sometimes embellished, occasionally inaccurate, but the core truth remained. A cowboy rancher had once sworn an oath on his mother's grave to protect the innocent, and that oath had shaped not just his life, but the lives of everyone he touched. And at the center of that story was always Charlotte, the woman who had ridden into his life pursued by evil men, the woman who had taught him that an oath could be both kept and transcended, the woman who had loved him enough to release him from his chains so he could choose them freely. In the end, that was the real legacy, not the oath itself, but what the oath had made possible. A love that transformed two people and rippled outward to change a community, a region, a state. A promise that began with death but led to life in all its fullness. The hill where the three of them were buried became a landmark, a place where people would sometimes come to reflect on their own choices and commitments. Young people especially seemed drawn to it, standing before the graves and thinking about what kind of oath they might make, what kind of life they wanted to build. And on spring evenings, when the Arizona sky blazed with color, and the wind carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, some people swore they could feel something there on that hill. Not ghosts exactly, but presences. The sense that something important had happened there, something that continued to matter long after the participants were dust. A mother who had died too soon but whose love had never faltered. A son who had transformed grief into purpose. A woman who had ridden into danger and found salvation. 3 lives, intertwined across death itself, proving that the bonds we forge can outlast any separation. The oath Caleb made that day, standing over his mother's fresh grave, had indeed required release from the one person he loved most. But Charlotte's release had not ended the oath. It had perfected it, transforming it from an obligation into a choice, from a burden into a calling, from a chain into wings. And so the story ended where it began, on a hill in Arizona, with 3 graves and 3 lives connected by love, loss, and the unbreakable promise that gave meaning to them all. The cowboy rancher had kept his oath. The woman he loved had freed him from it. And together, they had proven that the greatest promises are those we choose to keep even after we are released from them, because they define not what we must do, but who we choose to be. In the vast sweep of history, Caleb and Charlotte Vaughn were just 2 people, living ordinary lives in an ordinary place. But they had done something extraordinary. They had loved fully, lived purposefully, and left behind a legacy that transcended their own mortality. The oath had been the beginning, but love was the ending, and in that perfect circle they had found everything worth finding: meaning, purpose, connection, and the knowledge that their lives had mattered. The Arizona sun continued to rise and set over that hill. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and new generations continued to be born, to struggle, to love, to make their own promises. And always in the background, the story of Caleb and Charlotte whispered its truth, that we are defined by the promises we keep, the people we love, and the legacy we leave behind. The oath had been sacred. The love had been transformative. The life had been well lived. And in the end, what more could anyone ask?